What's up, guys? Welcome to another episode of the Mindset Cafe podcast. As always, it's yours truly, Devin Gonzalez, and we're here to, help you on your journey with mindset, with personal development, whether it is in the entrepreneurial space, whether it is with your relationships. And today I have a special guest for you guys, the author of Passion Struck. He is not only a world-renowned keynote speaker and a author and a podcast host of one of the top ranking podcasts in alternative health, but his story and his book, honestly, it aligns with a lot of the stuff that we talk about here on the Mindset Cafe. So I want to introduce to you guys John Miles. How you doing today?
Man, Devin, it is so nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Of course. Honestly, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm sure that you're, busy doing a book tour and everything right now. So I'm happy to have you, and I'm excited to dive into Passion Struck. The book is amazing, and the takeaways from it, I really want to dive in because there's so much knowledge in this book that honestly I don't want to waste a minute if you're ready.
Let's dive in, and thank you for that.
Of course. So in Passion Struck, actually before we even dive into the four pillars and the 12 steps, you know, what what led you to write Passion Struck?
So I have had an inner voice that has has been there for many years, and it was calling me to do something with my life where I was helping people who felt hopeless or lonely or beaten or broken or bored. And I think, like many people, when you get this inner voice, and my background was I was a naval officer turned consultant turned senior executive, and you're sitting here in the Fortune 50 C suite saying, what am I supposed to do with that? And so it's one of those things where I think the universe sometimes initially taps you on the shoulder, then they might kick you in the knee, then maybe a bat to the back, and then eventually a sledgehammer. And that's kind of the process that it went for me, because I think it's difficult to go from where you are in life to taking this big leap of faith to do something completely new. And it was that path to really looking at the person that I once was. And I think we're best positioned to help the person we once were. And so I wrote this to help anyone who's stuck, who's struggling. It could be the new college graduate who's trying to figure out how do they make their next best steps. It could be the high achievers who's plateaued, who's trying to figure out how do they get from where they're at to the next step. It could be the person who's completely stuck. They're burned out. They don't feel like they have any meaning in their life or significance. And how do they build their life back brick by brick? So it fits many different people. And I wanted to teach people, how do you create a life of flourishing? How do you create a life where you live it in a limitless way?
That's amazing. What's amazing also is your book, like you're living proof of being passion struck, right? You went from a naval officer to the corporate world to being a keynote speaker for Lowe's, Keller Williams, Salesforce, and a plethora of others, to now really focusing on mindset. So if you take one end of the spectrum, when you think of a naval officer, you think of someone that's really hard and mean and in your face, to someone that now is really focusing on helping someone come out of their shell and find their true passion. What was that switch from the Navy to corporate to now being a mindset and author?
Devin, I think it was an evolution. So I have had to reinvent myself numerous times throughout my life. And this is something that I talk about in the book quite frequently. And it's also something that I think the listeners need to understand. One of the people I examined as I was writing this is a person named Dan Schwabel, who's a partner and research director at Future Workforce. And he interviewed more than 1,200 remarkable individuals that ranged from CEOs to celebrities, authors, politicians, even astronauts. And throughout his different conversations, he keenly observed a prevailing characteristic shared amongst all of them, and that is the constant pursuit of reinvention. And I guess that's something that I did in my own career is I was always looking for ways to up level to reach the next aspiration that I had and to build a life of what I felt was significance in the different evolutions that I was taking throughout it. So I looked for different natural ways to pivot. Now, some of them came to me in unnatural ways, and some of them came to me naturally, I would say, meaning some were forced upon me that I had to pivot. Others, I made the conscious choice to pivot. But I just think more people, as we're entering this age of AI, automation, robotics, digital technology, and constant change, we're all going to be faced with more evolution in our life than I think in the history of the world. And I think all of us needs to embrace change like I've learned how to do it in my career.
100%. I think that big word you're saying is evolution. Life is adaptive, right? And you have to adapt with your new version and realize that you're not stuck being someone that you've been in the past just because you're either told that you're that person or you think that that's as high as you can go. So you making basically a 360 change from the Navy to the corporate world, and now again a 360 change to the entrepreneurial space and really into passion and you finding your why and finding your purpose is, it's a change, and you're living proof and a testament to, you know you can change and continue to grow and continue to level up, and you're not stuck being someone just because that's who you've been in the past. um, and honestly, that's amazing. Let's dive a little bit into the book. What are the four pillars, so the listeners kind of understand, from the mindset shift to the habits to the motivation, like what are your four pillars?
I would say that there are really three core pillars and another pillar that surrounds them. So if you would think about this as if you were looking at Mickey Mouse and you've got two big ears on each side, one of them is mindset, another one is behavior.
Mhm.
And then the third one would be deliberate action that sits underneath those two. And around all of that resides your intrinsic motivation, which is the fuel that really ignites them to work in unison. So let me break this down. The first step in the journey of transformation begins by reshaping your mindset. And this is a step that's illuminated by the virtue of wisdom. This passion driven wisdom plays a key role for our new actions, establishing a foundation for significant change. And you can think of this as these mindset shifts clarify our why and influence how we approach challenges and opportunities. And then that leads us to behavior shifts. And once our mindset has been recalibrated, the next logical progression is a shift in behavior where the role of perseverance becomes crucial. Our behavior is the what, and it's a direct reflection of our mindset, dictating how we act in pursuit of goals. And then lastly, there's deliberate action. And action plays a non linear role in the intertwined processes of reshaping our mindset and behaviors, acting both as a driver and as an outcome of these transformation. And you can think of deliberate action as the when and the where that you're taking these mindset and behavior shifts. And then all of that is, like I said before, fueled by the intrinsic motivation, which acts as the cohesive glue linking mindset, behavior, and deliberate action. So that's a great way to think about the pillars and how they kind of come together throughout the book.
What can you dive in a little bit to what is intrinsic motivation? Because I know a lot of people hear motivation and they hear, inspiration. And so diving into and explaining a little bit what intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations would be?
Yeah, so many of us today, I think, are motivated by the extrinsic factors in our lives. These are things that give us external validation, and they are normally things like recognition, success, money, fame, those, getting a higher position at work. And so many of us pr- look upon those as where we see our value. Whereas intrinsic motivation are things that are internal to us. There are relationships, there are personal aspirations, there are beliefs, our values, our goals. And it's aligning ourselves to those instead of the intrinsic things. And what I have found and what the research shows is you have so much more happiness and contentment when you're focused on the intrinsic things than when you're constantly trying to focus on the extrinsic motivators.
Now, how does one find their intrinsic motivation or their why?
Well, I think that's one of the fundamental questions of life, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, Simon Sinek wrote a whole book on this, but I tackled this a little bit in my first principle of the 12 principles that I go through called the mission angler. And this is really how do you find your defining purpose? And I called it a mission angler on purpose because anyone who's a fisherman knows that when you're going out there to find your catch, you're typically trying to craft a vision or a strategy for where you're going to find the most fish that day. So you're looking at tides, you're looking at time of day, you're looking at water depth, water temperature, all those things. But I don't think enough of us put intentional effort into thinking about how we're life crafting, which is akin to that mission angler. And it's an active process that entails reflecting on your present self and where you want your future life to be. And it's then setting goals in crucial areas like relationships, career, well being. You have it. But to me, I think where a lot of people go wrong on this is they think it's going to be this simple thing that's going to come to them. And I think we all realize that finding your purpose or that life that you're trying to craft is a long term journey. And to me, it starts and ends with self awareness. It's doing the intentional work to understand what is that deep rooted thing that's inside of you that's calling you to solve a problem that's in the world that only you can solve. And so, for instance, I highlighted Gary Vee, Vaynerchuk, who many of the listeners probably know. But Gary found that his life calling was to create this Vayner Media organization where he is, helping people to learn how to get their message out by him teaching people how to create brand stories, personal branding, etc. And so for him, it was not only finding that it was his calling, it was having that inner drive to deep dive into it to understand, why was that burning such a desire in him and then how to express it openly to the world. It's going from understanding his present self to where he wanted his future self to be. And I think what ends up happening to too many of us when we're on this journey is Benjamin Hardy wrote a great book with Dan Sullivan called The Gap and the Gain. So many of us live our lives once we've cultivated this purpose, living it in the gap versus the gain. And the gap is when we try to look at our present self and compare it to someone else that we see on the outside that we're trying to emulate. It would be me being a podcaster trying to compare myself to Jay Shetty. Whereas the gain is you comparing yourself to your previous self and the gains that you're making. And I think that's a key part of really not only understanding your purpose, but cultivating it is to try to live your life in that gain versus trying to be in the gap, which I think so many has fallen into the trap of doing.
Wow, that's amazing. And I want to rewind for a second. You mentioned, being intentional, and in your book, you talk about intentionality being a muscle that grows with every use. Can you elaborate a little bit on that analogy?
Yeah, I think intentionality is kind of like courage. Courage is often something that we're not born with, but it's as you're growing up and you're a toddler and you learn to walk and you learn to start expanding your universe, you get more and more courage to take additional steps to do additional things in your life as you grow up. And the same thing with courage is intentionality. It's something that is a skill that we can learn how to develop it more fully. And a way I like people to think about this is in our life, we have easy choices and we have hard choices. To me, the easy choices are the unintentional ones that we make, so many of us, on an everyday basis, that it may be your friends are going out for a beer and you're a college student and you know you've got this paper to write that could get you closer to where your aspirations lie, but you take the easy path and you go out and have a drink because you say I can work on this another day, and you procrastinate that thing that's the higher precedence. But so many of us do this with our life goals and our ambitions, and we constantly make the easy choices, which take us further and further, not only away from our goals, but oftentimes they go against our core beliefs, our core values. Where our intentional decisions, our intentional habit formation, I liken it to doing the harder things in life. It's making that decision, maybe when you've got a peer group who believes something different, but you stand by your convictions and you take that harder route. And, something I talk about in the book is sometimes being right means being alone. And that's a very difficult thing to do, but it's really living within your convictions. And I think what too many of us fail to do, and I'm just as guilty of it as anyone else, is we know we need to make changes in our life, but we keep ignoring it. We keep taking the easy path. We keep living our lives. The term most people hear is on autopilot instead of making the intentional decisions to do something different. And what it culminates into is either a tsunami of greatness or a valley of despair. And I think it's important for your listeners to understand how huge an issue this is. Cornell University in 2018 did a study of thousands of people nearing the end of their life, and they asked them all, what was the greatest regret you had in life? 76% of them came back with the same answer. It was not pursuing the aspirations that would have created a flourishing life. And instead, they took the easier path and ended up with huge regrets at the end of their life. And so, a core thing that I'm trying to teach throughout this book and my podcast and everything else is don't be that 76%. Try to be the other subset where you've lived this life that is limitless, that is flourishing, that is passion struck.
No, I mean that's amazing, and I think it kind of relates to what you talk about in the book about embracing discomfort, taking risks, right? And a lot of people don't like to be uncomfortable. They like to stay within their comfort zone and kind of stay complacent. With the passion struck mindset, how would one start to cultivate, you know, that ability to have that self belief and, start to really take that first step to actually being on the journey to their passion?
Okay, and Devin, I'm going to just stop you for 1 second. Do you see the error on the screen?
No.
Okay, I have something that says quote exceeded error. You have run out of free disk space to save a local backup of this data. I recommend that you stop the recording and clear out some disk space to prevent possible data loss. I
It,
know it's not on my end because I have a brand new computer.
I mean, everything's good on my end.
Okay.
And I'm seeing I can still see your and I'll edit this out, but I could still see yours is recording and everything like that. So,
Okay. Okay.
um,
Can you just ask me that one more time? Because I got distracted when I saw that message.
no, of course. So, with what you were saying, right now, I think it relates to what you mentioned in the book about, embracing discomfort and taking risks. And that starts to align with the fact of having a passion struck mindset. But how would one start to cultivate the abilities and the qualifications to take that first step towards their passion and, with the mindset in mentioned in your book?
Yeah. So this ties into a chapter that I wrote that's on the fear confronter concept. And what this chapter is all about is facing and dismantling your deepest self doubts. And the key thing that I try to teach people in this chapter is we are our biggest competitor. We so often let negativity and fear and imposter syndrome and all these things dismantle our belief system. And we develop this mindset of, I can't give that speech because I don't think the crowd is going to resonate with what I have to say. I can't write that book because I can't find the time to devote to it. I can't go from this senior manager position I am into a director one because I don't possess the skills to do it. And in this chapter, I highlight a number of different people who we have seen in our lives that we can resonate with. One of them is Novak Djokovic, who arguably now is the greatest tennis player who ever lived. But if you looked at Novak at the beginning of his career, and even in the early days when he was playing against Nadal and Roger, no one in a million years would have thought he would have come to this level. At first, he had huge self doubt. He wasn't strategically thinking about how he was crafting his game. And then for him, a light bulb went off, and he decided that if he could be intentional about how he was preparing for matches, intentional about how he got mentally tougher, so that when he was in a match, he knew he was going to be more mentally tough than anyone else. He knew he was going to be physically stronger. He started building confidence up. And with each step of courage that he took, each intentional action, it enabled him to confront more and more of the fears that he was facing until he developed himself into the most dominant player on earth. Uh, Something that you could also see in Hilary Swank, the actress. And I think we all see Hillary today. She's a multiple time Oscar winner, but what we don't see is her for years living with her mom out of a minivan trying to get a break in Hollywood. And she had so many fears and doubts at that time, but she managed to, you know, take a risk on herself. She was willing to put herself out there and took a measly $3,500 for the role that she ended up winning an Oscar for, knowing that if she put herself in a place where her talents could shine, the world would recognize it and she would propel herself from it. Now, those are a couple of extreme examples, but I think each of us has that same opportunity. And the biggest thing we need to take out of our vocabulary are the two words I can't and replace them with I can. And that's, to me, foundational to everything that being passion struck is all about.
No, that's awesome. And I think that kind of aligns with there was a quote that I've heard. I can't think of who said it right now, but it was, "What if it doesn't turn out as as it should, or what if it doesn't turn out as as I think it can?" But if you flip that and you say, "Well, what if it turns out better than you can ever imagine?" Right? You have to take those risks to find out, and you have to be willing to get uncomfortable to excel and exceed and to really take that journey. I mean, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it, right? If it was easy and it was, a no brainer, then it wouldn't really have any value intrinsically or extrinsically, right? So with that, what is your, actually, let's kind of rewind a little bit. I know before we go into the 12 steps, because I know we touched on that for a split second, you mentioned something about personal branding, and I know you've done some keynote speaking events and stuff on personal branding. How do you think personal branding ties into getting uncomfortable and showing your true self intentionally on social media or in any other fashion?
Yeah. And Devin, before I do that, can I just give one more example of overcoming self doubt
Of
just to
course,
anchor this point in?
of course.
So I had someone on the podcast earlier this past year. Her name is Oksana Masters. And Oksana was born without limbs on her without her legs, and she was born in Russia and spent the first years of her life in and out of care systems in Russia where she had very little to eat. She was raped multiple times by her guardians. She saw her friends go through the same thing, many of them succumbing to it all and losing their life. And she kept her hope alive that someday someone would come and save her. And that person eventually came, and adopted her, brought her to the United States, and taught her that no matter what her past was, no matter how bad she thought she had it, that everything was possible. And fast forward to today, she competes in the Paralympics and is a 16-time gold medalist now across 3 or 4 different sports. And I tell that story because even when we're born into the worst situations, we often talk about it's your zip code, it's the family situation you're brought into. And so many of us let those internal early life stages influence who we become. And I just showcase her as someone who didn't let those things defeat her. She learned how to defeat them and craft this life that she wanted. Now, on the topic of personal branding, I'll tell you, if the audience is anything like myself, being a corporate person like I was, Dell, Lowe's, whoever it may be, they're not encouraging me at that time to create a personal brand. They were wanting me to talk about the company and the initiatives we were doing, or to talk about technology progress or some type of strategy like that. And when I was at Dell, I happened to see a peer of mine, Victor Federer, who was doing the same job I was doing, a similar role, but he also had this persona on LinkedIn, and I saw him on some of the social channels where he was constantly putting out content. He was writing blogs, he was writing just posts where he was showing his perspective on things. And looking back, I didn't realize how powerful that was. Because if you think about your personal brand, even if it's in a work related situation, say you're in a sales role and you're going to call on a client. Well, before that client meets with you, the first thing they're going to do is try to look you up and see what information they can find on you. And if you've started to craft a strong personal brand, then they're going to learn more about you from that image that you've projected. And I think that's something that's very important for people to realize is you can craft how you want to be perceived by others. The same thing goes with, let's take it in your personal life and you meet someone that you want to start dating. I mean, that person's going to look you up. And when they do, the better projected personal brand you have, I think leads into the greater opportunity that they're going to be interested in you. It's the same thing with you working with a peer at work. Maybe you're starting a new project. First thing you want to know is what makes this person tick. So, my point in explaining this is I think there was a time when people didn't think about the need for personal branding, but it's absolutely critical because it leads to your new jobs, it leads to relationships, it leads to sales. And so I wish earlier in my career I would have done more work on being intentional about crafting that brand. And I remember when I started this whole Passion Struck brand and I was thinking about writing the book, I started sharing my book proposal with different agents, and they all came back with, how do you know this is going to resonate? You don't even have a personal brand. And at the time, I don't even think I had an Instagram account.
Oh,
And I look now, now 475,000 followers later, thousands on LinkedIn, etc. It was being intentional about wanting to craft an image for myself that people would resonate with. But I think where people get this wrong is they start going into it and they put out some posts, start doing some blogs, whatever, but they're not consistent about it. And to me, the key to forming a lasting brand is to be consistent about getting your mindset out, getting your words of wisdom out, and doing the hard things. I mean, I don't know anyone who likes to create videos about themselves and put it on social media. I mean, it's uncomfortable, but it's like being intentional. The more you do it, the more courage you have to do more of it and the better you get. It's the same thing I'm sure you've seen with hosting this podcast. I remember looking back at my initial episodes and cringing compared to where I've evolved to. And I think the same thing goes with building a personal brand.
no, definitely. And I think to add to that too, it's building your personal brand is just showing, even if you want to only show a certain light for, to build a personal brand, it's showing you, right? It's easy to post, pictures of you and your friends. Let's say you're in college drinking and getting smashed at the bars. You have no problem posting that. But yet, if you're trying to post anything that is helpful or towards your passion, all of a sudden you hesitate. Why? Because it's uncomfortable because you don't know how people are going to resonate with that, when in reality it's just one of those things you have to grow with it. And after you start to do it enough times, it gets comfortable for you. People realize that's what you do. But I mean, I think it's huge. And honestly, if I've looked at some of your social medias, I've listened to some of your podcasts, and your personal brand now, I would say, from not having Instagram to where you are now is amazing. So definitely keep up the work on that. um, I want to transition back to the book though, because again, there's honestly this book, you guys have to get it. I know it's not out yet, but this book is definitely, it'll help out. It'll help you in your relationships, your professional life, your personal life. Honestly, like I can't wait to keep, finishing the last few pages, because this book is just jam packed with just knowledge. But let's just touch real quick on the 12 steps. I know we mentioned earlier the mission angler, um, but I just want to kind of just highlight the 12 steps without really going too into detail, because I do want people to actually read it and get the knowledge for themselves.
Yeah, so let me give you the background on this because I think it's important for people to understand. So prior to me even launching this, I found myself as a fractional executive. I had started before I did this. I built another company which was really doing placement of fractional executives, and I myself would go into these roles, and that became a multiple seven and then 8-figure business. But one of these roles was I was the chief marketing officer, but this company had a couple of publications, and I was asked to become the associate publisher, which I never thought I was going to do. But for a period of time, we lost our editor, so I became the editor in chief as well. And I started this segment called the Bold Leaders Spotlight. And I was highlighting bold leaders who were out there against a different criteria. Most of it was business related. And I started to see the same patterns. And I'd been doing years of research at that point myself, trying to understand, why does someone like Mark Benioff, how is he able to go from, UC Berkeley to working at Apple to going to Oracle, to giving up the youngest VP position, someone who could have replaced Larry Ellison, to understanding that he needed to make a pivot and then having the audacity to create Salesforce and take it to where it's at today. Like, what makes someone like that create that transformation? And I kept seeing this pattern occur again and again. And so these 12 principles are from research that I conducted over 7 years, from looking at bold leaders, from looking at other people whom I had worked with, to professional athletes, actors, astronauts. And I started out initially with a list of like 30 characteristics, but I found that these 12 principles kept coming up again and again when I looked at people who had lived remarkable passion struck lives. And so I kind of do this in an order of 6 mindset shifts, like I said, 6 behavior shifts. But it starts out with the mission angler, which is all about life crafting. It then goes into a chapter of, once you have typically figured out this life you want to craft, you then have to start crafting your brand so that it goes in conjunction with it. So I call this chapter being a brand reinventor, and it's really about how do you constantly reinvent yourself throughout life as you face different trials and tribulations and changes. It then goes into a chapter I call the mosquito auditor, which is really how do you audit out the human mosquitoes and influences in your life that are keeping you away from living the life you want. The next chapter I talked about is the fear confronter, which is going from saying I can't to saying I can in life. I then go into a chapter called the perspective harnesser. And this is really about how do you cognitively reshape situations so that you understand when you're facing adversity that you look at it with the perspective that trying times end, that there's a beginning and an end of any adversity that you're going to face. It goes beyond that, but it's really looking at how do you reshape your perspective on things so that you approach different life events differently and how you're on this pursuit. And then the last chapter in that section is called the action creator. And this is one of the most important. This is really about action creates further action. And this chapter, I tell the story of astronaut Wendy Lawrence and why it's so important for us to take deliberate action so that we give ourselves permission to live the dreams that we want. And then the behavior shifts start with how do you achieve the zone of optimal anxiety? And I call it the anxiety optimizer chapter. And it's really how do you learn how to put yourself purposefully into a flow state so that you're performing at your best and undertaking peak performance. I then go from that chapter into kind of the antithesis of, if you're looking for those human mosquitoes, once you've identified them, how do you become a boundary magnifier, and how do you properly put boundaries into your life? And so as you're confronting influences and people who are taking you farther away, how do you create these boundaries so that you can stay true to the life that you're wanting? I then go into how do you become an originality embracer? Like, how do you celebrate your uniqueness? And I kind of talk about this concept of multiple brains within each of us: our cranial brain, our cardiac brain, and our gut intelligence. And these are interconnected sources of wisdom that shape our decision process, ultimately determining our capacity to adapt or falter in the face of change. And I really use the story of Jeff Bezos and my discussions with him to highlight this. The next chapter after that is how do you become an outward inspirer? And this is, I think so many of us have run into people who, say the right things, but then you watch their actions and they do something completely different. So this is really about how do you start living your life by talking with your feet, meaning your actions. And I highlight Susan Wojcicki, who's the former YouTube CEO, because she's a master at this. And then I go into a new type of leadership that I think is needed in this new age called a gardener leader. And this is a person who leads with intention, and it's growing your influence like a gardener nurtures a garden by being eyes on but hands off. And I use the leadership examples of General McChrystal and Keith Crotch, who was the former CEO of DocuSign, to discuss this chapter. And then lastly, I go into one of my favorite chapters in the book called The Conscious Engager. And this is really about the fact that in order to accomplish anything that we want to do in life, it really takes a conscious effort to deliberately focus on the most important thing and make sure that you keep that thing the most important things in your life. And so those are the 12 different principles that I cover. And then the third portion of the book is then really about understanding. I give an exercise where I outline the 5 different plateaus on becoming passion struck. And I have a quiz now that people can take that's on the website that will identify their starting point. And throughout the rest of the book, I tell you how do you take deliberate action to put those mindset and behavior shifts into action so that this isn't just a book you're reading, because that's not why I wrote it. I wrote it so that it's something that you live. So, how do you take these fundamental principles and put them to action into your life?
See, that's amazing. And before we wrap up, one of those chapters I thought was interesting, and I know some people will kind of resonate with, or at least get a little chuckle realizing who their mosquitoes are. Um, Before we wrap up, I just want you to touch on like the mosquitoes thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the favorite chapters that keeps coming up. And as I was thinking about this, I originally had approached it completely differently. But as I often do when I'm writing, I find sometimes we get the most inspiration by being out in nature. And so I took my dog for a walk as I was trying to think about how do I approach this in a different way. And I was thinking through it, and after about 20 minutes decided to put my earphones in and started listening to a podcast, and the host was talking about the most dangerous animal on the planet and asking us in the audience who did we think it was. And I think like many people, my head was all around maybe the poisonous jellyfish, that they're these microscopic jellyfish in Australia that if you're bitten will kill you in 30 minutes, or the most venomous snake, or a you know a shark, whatever it may be. And I think, like most people, we were surprised when the person said none of those makes a dent compared to the number of lives a mosquito takes in our life. I mean, I think it's like 1 million to 2 million people die per year from the infections that are spread by mosquitoes. And it got me thinking, just like there are these invisible mosquitoes that we don't even realize are creating havoc until they bite us, and then they have these cascading effects. So much are the human mosquitoes or the human influences that we run into that keep us from living the life that we want. I mean, I think we've all heard this saying, we become the 5 people we most surround ourselves with. So this chapter was really trying to help people in more of a comical way understand what these invisible influences are and what they're doing to you. So in this chapter, I, at a high level, give 3 different types: the bloodsucker, which you can think of as a boundary destroyer; the invisible suffocator, who's that pessimist in your life; and the PETA, or pain in the ass, who's just that person that causes you a headache all the time. And because once you recognize who these people are, whether it's toxic family members, peers, or subordinates at work, your friend circle, you can recognize them, and then it's up to you to do something about it.
That's awesome. When I went through that section, I was laughing. I was like, I love this analogy. I didn't know how you really came up with it, but that's even better. Of how you came up upon discovering that with listening to the podcast. And right when you said it, I started thinking of sharks and tigers. So that's hilarious. Where can people connect with you? And I know your book's not out yet, but where can people buy your book as well?
Yeah, so I happen to have a copy of the book here. Um, it's an advanced reader copy, and right now it's available for pre-sale, and you can buy it at Amazon, uh, Barnes and Noble, Walmart, Target, anywhere that you can purchase books. But once you do that, if you come to the Passion Struck website, passionstruck.com/Passion Struck book, if it's a pre-order, I have personally gone through and created a number of bonuses. I mean, I say they tally for $300. They cost me far more than that to create, but this these are some ebooks. One is on the topic we talked about earlier, intrinsic motivation. How do you create it if you're a leader? How do you utilize it in the workforce? How do you utilize this in your personal life? I have another ebook that I did on I explain at a high level what the deliberate action process is in the book, but this is like a 60-page workbook that has exercises and detail on how you implement it. And for me, it's allowed me to 10x my life, 10x every single position I've been in. And I'm giving this gift of something that's worked for me for decades to the reader. I also, to answer your question on how do you find your purpose, I have a masterclass on it that they also get access to, plus the first chapter of the book. And they also get access to my live book launch event, which will be at the end of January. So passionstruck.com is the best place to go, and you can buy the book anywhere.
Awesome. I'll definitely put that in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on, guys. If you got anything from this show, from this episode, which I know you did, please share it with a friend, leave a 5-star review, and as always, see you on the next one. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.